First, we'd like to, which we've just done, is introduce the Citizen Advisory Committee and talk a little bit about their role. And so their role is to advise the Director of Public Safety and the Mayor in the hiring of a new police chief. The Director of Public Safety, Charlene Deacon, is the one responsible for making the final selection in conjunction with the Department of Personnel and the Mayor's office and who the next police chief will be. But it's really important that we have input from community members, from you, from our partners and other key stakeholders. So we also want to learn from the public the qualities of an ideal police department and the skills and experiences desired of the new police chief to lead that department. So much of the content today will be asking you to share with us and share with your facilitators, and we'll be taking diligent notes about what you think are the qualities of a successful and harmonious police department, as well as what are the qualities and experiences in a police chief that you'd like to see. We have other outcomes, but finally we'd like to talk about opportunities for healing our community through improved police and community relationships. That's obviously one of the major things that we'd like to talk about today and over the next couple months as we go through this process. So please don't hold back when you're speaking with your facilitators. We think this will be a good event and a good process to go through that will elicit hopefully the outcomes we're looking for. I'd also like to briefly go over the hiring process. Not everyone here may be familiar with what it looks like to hire a police chief, particularly a police chief that is a civil service position. So in the city of St. Louis, the technical title for this position is police commissioner. So our commissioner is a civil service position. Once they're hired, they report to the director, which is the Director of Public Safety, who in turn is appointed by the mayor. And so we are looking at multiple ways that we could go through this. There's two main avenues that we could take to approach. We have one more of our committee members who just joined, and if we still have that microphone somewhere, maybe we could ask him to briefly introduce himself.
My name is Marius Johnson Malone. I work with Better Together, resident of Tower Grove East.
All right, thank you. So there's two main ways by which we could select a police chief. One, we can do it in-house the way we do with many positions. We list it on our website. We do our own in-house outreach. We do interviews with city staff and key partners. That process can take anywhere from 6 to 8 months for a high-profile position like this, particularly where we want to elicit input from our partners here and the committee. Input would include input on our job description, so helping craft that. Also recruitment strategy, how we can reach out, identify, and try to bring in key individuals from within the department and outside the department. Conduct public forums like this and panel interviews with individuals. And finally, some input on the finalists. Again, remembering that the final position will be chosen by the Director of Public Safety, as that person is responsible for that position. An alternative would be to issue a request for proposals or an RFP to hire a law enforcement executive search firm. So these firms exist throughout the country, individual organizations like International Associations of Chiefs of Police that often work with cities and communities and counties to select high-level law enforcement executives. That makes the process take a little bit longer, could take as long as 9 months. And what would happen then is the advisory committee would provide a lot of input to the RFP, so the bidder who we end up selecting, to provide input on the exact same thing. So recruitment materials, job descriptions, advertising, key stakeholders, public forums, and then finally the review of finalists. So either way, the advisory committee is going to have a pretty significant input on whatever those final positions and candidates reach the Department of Public Safety Director for final decision. But the difference between the two is one, if we do go in an RFP, the bidding organization does have the capacity and some relationships that we don't if we do want to recruit heavily from other departments. At the same time, they do take a little bit longer and need to learn more from our committee and our residents about what are the qualities that St. Louis is looking for in a police chief. So there are pros and cons to each of these, and I know you may have some of your own thoughts. So that's the rough overview. It's probably going to take anywhere from 6 to 9 months to go through this process if there's no hiccups along the way. We anticipate multiple forums. We anticipate multiple opportunities for the committee to provide input, both to the Department of Personnel, to the Department of Public Safety, to the mayor's office as we construct the job descriptions, construct the RFP if we go that route, and then input on specific candidates. All of the meetings will be open to the public except when we are interviewing and talking about specific candidates. Unfortunately, we have to keep that private just to protect those individuals in case they're, for a variety of reasons, one of which perhaps they still employed somewhere else or employed.
if we select someone from within the department, we may not all be happy, but I'm convinced if that person is a person that is not African American, Hispanic, or of color, I just really don't feel that the police chief, because he's white, is going to be biased.
Whomever this chief is and comes in, the cultural divide that exists within the police department itself, until that gets addressed, I don't see how we can go into the community and try and work together.
We need a chief who has experience being around all different nationalities and different religions.
Are going to do a brief summary of their questions. I've instructed them to basically pull 2 major points from their 3 questions, so you'll get kind of a gist. The next phase for us is to actually take all of this, summarize your small group discussion. We will not only have the raw data, but we'll have the major things that seem to show up in all of the groups. After that, I'm going to hand it back over to Nicole. So.
A couple of the highlights. The first highlight is for the first question, what does public safety look like day to day? Is the group said that we need to have an established partnership that includes trust. And one highlight that I also want to include was they said that the voices of our youth need to be included. In addition to that, we have the incoming police chief needs to be a manager for listening to all stakeholders and finding resources to support the needs of the community. And lastly, this person needs to know the history of race and diversity relations in St. Louis as well as within the department.
We talked about relationships different ways. Police to community, community to police, and community members among itself. We talked about the community's roles, and one of them was bravely bearing witness. So how can we be there for one another, look after one another when someone's been pulled over, when there's an ambulance in our community? How do we make sure we're asking questions? And we also talked about the biggest need being for the police chief to have knowledge of the segregation and race, the history of that in our city.
One person said, we want to make sure that they're open and transparent. The kind of clothes that they wear, not come into a school with military-like clothes, but actually come into the school so that young people will start to trust them. So that's what came out of our first one. Our second one, it really became real strong about the training and support in all of these areas. So training in racial equity, training around mental illness, training in cultural competency, and not just the minimum. In other words, raise the minimums and make it a requirement not only for the officers, but everyone in that department, so everyone is speaking the same language. The other piece was working in tandem with social workers, not necessarily just having the social worker for like the suicide prevention, but all of the areas that they get involved in. And the most important thing that came out for me is to understand that police officers have mental illness issues as well, and let's support them too. Last but not least, and when we go to the third question, I tended to think of the packet that we send out, and that packet needs to tell them to watch the Del Mar Divide, read Mapping Decline, look at the Pruitt-Igoe project, understand that there are 2 police unions, and how the city charter has fragmented us. So those are the points that came out of my group.
we really focused on police respecting the community regardless of race, including race, class, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic, and not seeing those as barriers to respect, but making sure that those are priorities. We also saw the need for integrating therapists, social worker, child protective services, instead of police officers being the first line of defense, looking to other mechanisms to help support when things are not a violent crime or burglary, things of that nature. We also focused on the first question about the citizens educating ourselves about ways that we can combat people from calling the police first. So knowing to call, the Department of Human Health Services first, calling a social worker first instead of calling the police for everything. For our second question, we focused on we broke it into 3 categories: cultural competence, mental illness, and racial equity. For cultural competence, we believe that the next police chief should be bilingual, at least 2 languages. And we also felt as though that there should be an open line of communication with all citizens in the city. So going to neighborhood watch groups, talking to advocacy groups, and making sure that they're in constant communication with the chief of police. And lastly, for that section, we also, to Jessica's point, needing the racial bias training, but making sure that it's a continuous process. It's not a one-time thing, but it's continuous. And then for our last section, we focus on things that the police chief really needs to know about St. Louis, the history of the racial divide, Ferguson, protests, and explaining the causes of those things. So not just leaving it at, these are the things that happened, but understanding why these things happened. The second thing we said was that they're not alone, that the community of St. Louis is here to support them and help them get what they need. And lastly, we said that the new chief police needs to not be afraid of blowing up the system. They don't have to stick with status quo, and they can create new ideas to make our city greater.
Young people have quite a number of interactions with police officers. So will there be some forum or some way to get the thoughts and ideas of our young citizens?
So I do think it's appropriate for officers to have input, but this is a community forum. So I think we should encourage officers to come to these forums and give their input alongside the community.
Well, do that.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely essential that we hear those voices as part of this process. There are a few examples from other communities that have looked for police chiefs where they prioritize hearing those voices with forums that were specifically for young people to come and speak about their vision for public safety and what they want to see in there. So I will certainly advocate for that.
I think it's important that the officers, not just the potential chief, but also the officers, understand this feedback that the community is giving and what they want in a police department and a police chief. They are public servants. When we pay their salary, this is what we want them to understand that.
So I just want to commend whoever put it together. It's important. I appreciate it, and I just wanted to say that.